I should say a few words about myself before I begin my presentation. My work since 2011 has been revolving around the politics and geopolitics of knowledge production as part of an ongoing revolution. And I've been trying to understand and think about the different ways why there is so much conflict about understanding what's happening in Syria, what I call the unthinkable revolution. Why is it that people on the ground see what is happening and label that and understand that as a revolution, and others describe it as a conspiracy theory and as intervention and as part of international politics and so on. And in the end, I think what really makes sense or made sense to me as part of this project is basically try to understand the conflict and the tension between micropolitics, international relations and intervention and civil war, all these macro processes, and micro politics, what's happening on the ground, the micro practices, what people are doing, and how they're resisting on an everyday basis. I'm Syrian. I lived in Syria for many years, and I've been going back to Syria more recently since 2011, in the beginning to Damascus, but then because of the organizing and fear of being caught by the Syrian regime, I started going to the northern areas through Turkey, smuggling through the borders, not showing my passport and so on. And I stayed in a small city in northern Aleppo, in the countryside of Aleppo, Manbij, for 3 months, mid-2013 and early 2014. And then ISIS took over the city and it became impossible to go through those areas. And many of the people I was working with, many of the people who were part of rebuilding that society, rebuilding some of the institution, left the country and are currently either in Turkey or a different part of Europe, Germany, France, and elsewhere. And so before I start talking about this notion and opposition between what I call popular nationalism, what people have been producing as a form of resistance, as a weapon against the state-sponsored nationalism or official nationalism. I would say that it's important not to present the Syrian revolution as a singular narrative. There are always those different, and overlapping maps or narratives about Syria. And I think that has been really a major error in trying to, talk and produce knowledge about Syria. Sometimes you hear people talking about sectarian conflict, opposing Sunni and Shia, and behind them there is Iran and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and so on. Proxy wars. There is also the global jihadist narrative has been really dominant and hegemonic since 2014. For some time, people were very interested in the Kurdish struggle for self-determination. More recently, and even in the beginning, the confrontation between Russia on the one hand and the West on the other, and so on. And for the most part, in all these narratives, what's missing is the Syrian revolution, what I'm calling the unthinkable revolution, because we're lacking some of the tools that are necessary to comprehend what's happening. The second thing I would say is that oftentimes what happens when people talk about Syria is the conflation between the military dimension and the conflict in Syria. And I think the military confrontation is important, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. What's beneath it, what's really happening in Syria, and what's most important is the civilian struggle, what people are doing day in, day out, the different ways and the different institutions they're creating, discourses, identities, narrative stories that they're producing to understand, comprehend, resist, and produce a different or post-Assad Syria, and that includes dances, slogans, graffiti, videos, plays, and so on and so forth, and also an alternative history. And finally, it's important to think about the Syrian revolution on the longue durée. What happens oftentimes is reducing our understanding on what happened in the past 18 months, 2 years. And I think this is really reductive and limited. in our understanding of a revolution. I mean, any scholar of revolutions will tell you that in order to produce an adequate understanding of the processes on the ground, we have to think about several decades, 2, 3, maybe 5 decades, to understand what's happening in the Arab world. And that's also been missing in Syria. So now, to begin my talk about the question of nationalism, what I'm calling popular nationalism, and the production of those national identities on the one hand, and how they're being produced to resist the nationalism produced by the Syrian state, the state-sponsored, the Ba'ath Party, centralized kind of nationalism. And I'm suggesting that the Syrian revolution cannot succeed unless Syrian produce a popular nationalism. This, identity or this narrative, the story that is necessary as a glue, to produce an alternative or post-Assad Syria. And the Syrian revolution is facing, obviously, powerful ideologies opposing that narrative of the popular nationalism that was very powerful and dominant in the beginning, 2011, 2012. Some of those narratives are about a global Sunni jihadi, ideology, Shia jihadism, all these different narratives about anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism, for some of the players backing the Syrian regime, the ethnic and sectarian belongings that also have been very powerful in some of the ways people have been trying to understand what's happening in Syria, the regional and tribal identities within Syria, people belonging to the north, to the south, to the coast, and so on. And then the official nationalism of the Syrian regime, which I will talk about in a minute. And most of these discourses function beneath or above the nation. So, for the Sunni and the Shia jihadism, as we can see it, for ISIS and for some of the Shia, the borders are not very relevant. I mean, you can remove them very easily and still function and be able to produce a narrative that is logical and rational for their audiences. And some of them are functioning beneath the nation. So for some of those, discourses about regionalism and about belonging to Aleppo, and we've seen some of those tensions happening. Aleppo as opposed to Damascus, the countryside as opposed to the city, and so on. And so I contend that without a powerful popular nationalism, the Syrian revolution is bound to fail. And to demonstrate the point, I will avoid academic discussion about, the literature on nationalism and focus on concrete example about the meaning of popular nationalism in the Syrian context today. Since the beginning of the Syrian uprising in March 2011, Syrians have been actively producing a new form of nationalism. And here I understand I'm proposing, a definition of nationalism as a contested terrain, as a battleground, as a battleground where you have different players and different forces trying to push for different and opposing narrative and discourses. And the paper examines popular nationalism in Manbij, a city in the Aleppo province located in northern Syria. The city, I think, provides an excellent site for the study of different aspects of popular nationalism. And the talk is based, as I said, on this research I've done in 2013 and early 2014. The regime is obviously proposing an official narrative to counter popular nationalism. Both nationalism, popular and official, are competing for hegemony. And as I said, it's a matter of existence for both parties, for both players. The groups allied to the Syrian revolution and the Syrian state. And those narratives also go on in parallel with the military confrontation that is currently taking place in Syria. The popular nationalism is a primary tool of resistance against the Syrian regime, and as such, it aspires to delink from official nationalism, the official ideology of the Ba'ath Party and the Assad regime. And the construction of popular nationalism requires a serious engagement with the history of nationalism in Syria, which dates back to the turn of the 20th century. Unlike state-sponsored nationalism of the Ba'ath Party, popular nationalism is grassroots, bottom-up, and liberatory. It's humanist. It first emerged to oppose the oppression of the ruling classes as well as the domination of the colonial powers. The emergent popular nationalism in Syria since 2011 should be understood as both a rupture with the state-centric nationalism of the Ba'ath Party and a continuation of the early popular nationalism of 1920 and 1925 and 26, the Great Syrian Revolt of that period. Popular nationalism is operating a dual move that alternates between the linking from an oppressive and centralized nationalism of the Ba'ath Party, which represents state terror, and connecting with, and at the same time connecting with democratic, decentralized, and multifaceted popular nationalism of the early 20th century. So just to give you a background about that early nationalism of 1919 and 1920, 1925, during the autumn of 1919, a broad coalition of intellectuals, notables, lower middle class religious dignitaries, qabadayat, and merchants was formed. They opposed King Faisal government, which they viewed as illegitimate and controlled by foreigners. They created democratic popular committees in many neighborhoods. For the first time, Syrians from all social backgrounds became involved in politics through popular committees. Not only did Syrians take matters in their own hands by creating a structure of democratic committees at the neighborhood, municipal, regional, and national levels, these committees threatened the power of the centralized government and they rendered local politics obsolete, while at the same time they made national democracy, democratic politic, commonsensical choice. And remember, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of local politics, regional, tribal, and so on. But the creation of the municipal communities and those popular committees really undermined that local politics, the politics of the notables. They were performing a number of tasks, including guaranteeing a fair price for grain, recruitment of volunteers for a committee of national defense, and providing relief to the displaced and the poor. The parallels between the popular nationalism of 1919 and 2011 are striking. Although explicit connections might not exist between the local coordination committees, which were formed in many neighborhoods in August 2011 and on, and the popular committees of 1919, the emergence of both in a moment when the state is experiencing a deep crisis is by itself telling. The popular nationalism of the early 20th century and the early 21st century have both created new institutions, cultures, and viable societies. In both cases, nationalism was not simply concerned about seizing state power, but rather about creating parallel structures to the state that would ultimately undermine the existence of the colonial and neo-colonial state. And this is important because, as you can see with the popular committees in Syria since 2011, they're not necessarily concerned about seizing state power, but about creating all these different institutions and discourses that are necessary to make their cities livable and viable, despite the bombing and the state violence and the state terror. The Great Revolt of 1925-26 was a catalyst for the propagation of a Syrian Arab identity in the countryside. To counter the successful resistance in the countryside, French authorities produced a lot of propaganda explaining that the revolt is not sustainable because the feudal elite cannot convince peasants to join their cause. They also distributed leaflets explaining that the revolt is sectarian and that non-Druze, because the Druze were obviously playing a major role, they were in the leadership, that the French explaining that the revolt is sectarian and that non-Jews would oppose it. The French propaganda was obviously ineffective. Peasants were willing to set their class differences aside and join the battle against French colonization. The Druze peasants in the south and Sunni and Christian grain merchants in Midan quarter in Damascus built an organic relationship through commerce because the Druze region in southern Syria was producing most of the grain, and they had built an important relationship between countryside, the production of the grain, and the merchant in Damascus through that circuit. When French bureaucrats introduced new policies that threatened their livelihood, Syrians quickly built a network of resistance that spanned from the Druze mountain in the south to Damascus. Druze, Christians, and Sunni were willing to cross sectarian lines to protect their economic interest and livelihood. What is important to note is that the rebels used flexible discursive strategies to undermine French power. In some cases, they advocated for Muslim solidarity. In others, they were propagating tribal culture and so on. While at times they highlighted class conflict, but they mostly used nationalist discourses. They maintained a fluid meaning of what it means to be a Syrian or an Arab. And this openness allowed different groups to join their battle and consider the combat of the colonial power as their main goal. The Great Syrian Revolt of 1925-26 generated a blend of Syrian and Arab nationalism based on loose meaning of patriotism, anti-colonialism, religion, and tribal honor. The French occupier lost no time to label the rebels as extremists, criminals, terrorists, and sectarian individuals who were concerned only in preserving the feudal system in Hauran. They used counterinsurgency and mass killing to quell the revolt. The aerial bombing, and that is one of the first aerial bombing in history, The aerial bombing was unprecedented at the time and punished the entire population of the region wherever the rebels took refuge. Al-Hariqa in Damascus was bombed for 2 consecutive days to drive the rebels out. Military might was always combined with the discourse to delegitimize the struggle of the revolutionaries. The French produced a counter-narrative about the sectarianism of the Druze to deter other religious communities from joining the struggle of the rebels. In addition, the French formed sectarian militias made of Armenians and Circassians to ignite sectarian violence, but the rebels responded by reminding Syrians that all sects, including Christian, Druze, Alawite, Shia, and Sunni, are sons of the Syrian Arab nation, and this is between quotation marks. This is the language that they were using at the time. France resorted to all forms of collective punishment and terrorization, including aerial bombardment, house demolition, public hanging, and displacement of entire population from different regions. On the long term, the asymmetrical power of the French and their counter-insurgency tactics were effective since the sympathy for the rebels gradually declined. When the revolt was finally crushed, 6,000 rebels were killed and more than 100,000 civilians were displaced. So now Arab nationalism after independence, 1946, that's when the French left Syria. So the second moment I explore briefly here is the Ba'ath Party authoritarian rule since 1963. The history of the Ba'ath Party and its rise to power is beyond the scope of this paper, but suffice it to say that the period from 1946, when Syria became independent, to 1963, when the Ba'ath Party seized power, was a turbulent one. Nationalist, communist, and Islamic groups were competing for power, sometimes using democratic means, while at others deploying force and military might. The intellectuals of the Ba'ath Party produced very rigid meanings of Arab identity that led to the exclusive brand of Arab nationalism, oftentimes very chauvinistic. And here you see the difference between the nationalism of the early 20th century, which was popular, which was not necessarily the production of literature and books and discourses, but about practices, producing different discourses and institution to resist and oppose the French. Whereas with the Ba'ath Party nationalism, clearly see the production of a nationalism that was interested in seizing state power and in dominating the political scene. The intellectuals of the Ba'ath produced very rigid meanings of Arab identity that led to an exclusive brand of Arab nationalism. In that regard, the nationalism of the Ba'ath was unlike the 1920s nationalism. Nationalists of the 1920s created a popular nationalism, while nationalists of the 1950s were interested in seizing state power. In the first case, nationalism was inclusive, and here I'm talking about the early nationalism of the 1920s. It was inclusive, organic, anti-colonial, and in second case, 1950s, 1960s, it paved the way for an authoritarian, exclusive, neo-colonial nationalist state. The former created a nationalism that could be could have produced a post-national or post-colonial state, while the latter used the state to produce and legitimate a discourse enveloped in a national rhetoric. So now the current revolt. In the current revolt, two nationalisms are competing for dominance. The first one is popular and anti-dictatorial, while the second is official and claims to be anti-imperial and anti-Zionist. The first one resonates with the nationalism of the great revolts of the 1920s, while the second is the heir of Pan-Arabism of the 1950s and 1960s. The current uprising is producing a new nationalism that strives to delink gradually from the state-centric nationalism of the Ba'ath Party and reinvent itself in part by connecting with the nationalism of the 20th century. And this is, a process, an ongoing process, where you see the popular nationalism of, the early, in the early part of the revolt in 2011, trying to reject and delink from that nationalism of the Ba'ath Party that's 50, 60 years old. And at the same time, try to link with the popular nationalism of the early 20th century. The process of delinking is delicate and at times costly. If it is performed too slowly, it could be co-opted and subverted, and we've seen that with the Syrian uprising in 2011. If you go too slowly, obviously other groups with Islamist ideology, with sectarian discourses and narratives could co-opt, that momentum. If it is too abrupt and destructive, it can leave a void that other competing groups are more than willing to fill. So if it's too quick, it's also problematic. And the question is to find the right balance between, the pace at which you want to produce that popular nationalism, which is very tricky. This explains why supranationalist and infranationalist groups such as the Islamic coalitions or Kurdish tribal and regional communities are dominating the scene today. To explore the significance of the emergence paradigm, I focus on Manbij, which is the strategic space for the study of the various moments of popular nationalism. The northern city provides an excellent point of entry for the exploration of three vital moments in the study of that popular nationalism. The first moment of popular nationalism takes place during the early period of the revolt before the liberation of Manbij, the city where I spent almost 3 months in northern Syria. This period is characterized by subterranean nationalism that tries to find its way to the surface. It's clandestine nationalism that could be explored in marginal localities or at nightfall when most public spaces are deserted. The prison is one such space where activists and organizers started creating new imagined communities when the revolt was in its early phase. And here I'm talking about Manbij when it was still controlled and dominated by the Syrian regime. The military and the police were still there, and so the emergence of that early nationalism could operate only in those marginal spaces, including the prison. And I did multiple interviews where I talked to people telling me that for the first time they could connect with people from different parts of Syria when they were put with activists from Damascus, from Aleppo, from Manbij, from Raqqa. And for the first time, they had this face-to-face kind of discussions about the future of Syria, what kind of Syria they desire, and so on. And those spaces were obviously lacking before that. So it's interesting to look at prison as a state, as a space of production for that popular nationalism I'm talking about, which is quite ironic. Clandestine nationalism in the early nationalism of the Syrian revolt is a clandestine nationalism, as I said, and it was trying to find its way to a large audience under extremely challenging conditions. This is why it developed in dangerous and marginal spaces and was used to resist the oppressor. Like popular nationalism of the early 20th century, which emerged as a tool of resistance against French hegemony and colonization, the nationalism of the 2011 revolt should be understood as an essential tool to oppose the violence of the regime and ultimately topple the Syrian despot. To explore this form of nationalism, we have to explore the work of clandestine committee that started forming in many cities, including Manbij. And here I'm going to skip a few pages. But when I talked to people on the ground, they told me that they were able to build an impressive network of popular committees without the regime ever knowing what was happening. They had 50 groups in Manbij, and when the regime left the city, overnight they were able to take over the city, and there was no violence, no crimes committed in the following week, because they were so present, but they were clandestine, they were underground. The second dimension, or the second phase, the second moment of that popular nationalism is after the liberation of the city. And I call that decolonial nationalism. And it's about cleansing the city from all these symbols and the slogans of the Syrian regime. And there are many different facets to that, from cleaning the streets to putting different slogans on the walls, to producing street festivals and theater and dances and so on, to the production of different narratives and institutions, the Revolutionary Council and the Revolutionary Trustee Council, and the takeover of different institutions, the production of alternative discourses and narratives and so on. And that's all part of the process of decolonizing your own city, decolonizing your own spaces that happened during that period of almost 18 months between the liberation of the city and the takeover by ISIS, which is the third moment in that short history. And that third moment is what I'm calling the incubator nationalism. When people were threatened by ISIS directly, many people were killed, many people were put in prison, and they had to go back to the private space of the home. And actually, a number of youth created this center they called Home in English and Arabic. And where they were teaching the youth languages, trying to teach, creating spaces for performances, theater, and painting, and so on. When I asked them why they felt that there was the need for such a space, one of the organizers of Home said, he explained that the Syria we were dreaming of and aspiring to create is becoming an illusion. Sectarianism and fundamentalism are eating up our Syria. I'm quoting him here. And this is why we felt the need to create that space, a home to preserve whatever can be preserved, and start planning all over again. And oftentimes they compared ISIS to the Syrian regime, and that we have to start all over again, with a minor difference. ISIS had the name of all the activists and knew all the major players and so on, and could easily target them, expel them from the city, kill them, whereas the Syrian regime didn't have those lists. So in conclusion, the three phases of popular nationalism described above, namely clandestine, decolonial, and incubator nationalism, show that the emergent paradigm is facing major challenges as it is developing and adapting. The nationalism that I described in Manbij was primarily meant to counter the Syrian regime discourse about inclusion to the Syrian nation state and state power. Popular nationalism constitutes a culture of resistance that is delinking from the oppressive structures of official nationalism of the Ba'ath Party, while at the same time reconnecting with the early history of Syria. The popular nationalism that developed in the early 20th century to resist French colonization, and the one that emerged in the past 4 years as an oppositional paradigm to Assad's Syria, have much in common, as shown through the multiple narratives described above. They are both non-elite culture that avoid following a script. They both developed through the everyday practices of a multitude of people. They are oppositional to state-centric nationalism that are perceived as oppressive and unjust. The popular nationalism is at a crossroads, since it has been marginalized and challenged by state and non-state actors. Syrian popular nationalism is not only facing the nationalism of the state of the Ba'ath Party. In addition, it is competing with Muslim identities imposed by groups such as ISIS, Ahrar Sham, and Nusra. In addition, it is challenged by sectarian and tribal identities operating in multiple localities. Finally, it is also being redefined by the nascent Kurdish nationalism in northern Syria. Some of these identities are operating below, while others are functioning above the nation state. They are all putting stress on popular nationalism to be more creative, open, and inclusive. This is one of the major challenges of popular nationalism in the coming few years, as the Arab and Syrian revolts are morphing and transforming. Thank you.